Morning, church. Nice to see you all again. I think it's been about, 3 or 4 weeks since I've seen you, but it's nice to be back here with you again. How many people went to camp? How many people come back from camp well? A different number, but it is nice to see you, and I'm glad that that you are well again, some of you. And it's good to start our Revelation seminar again. We were going through the book of Revelation. We had a little break over the holiday time, over camp time, and we're getting back into it today. And today we're going to look at Revelation chapter 7. Revelation chapter 7. Now, when we look at Revelation chapter 7, what would you say would be the focus for most people in this chapter? Anyone game enough to call it out? 144,000. Now, is that really the focus of the chapter, or is that what we ourselves focus on? Yeah, we tend to focus on that number, and we get carried away with that number. And depending on our theology will depend on how you view this number. Or, depending on how you view this number, it will actually shape your theology. Do you agree, Tim? Nice to have you here with us today. But, it's very interesting because when I grew up, I saw this number as a literal number. And when I saw this number as a literal number, I started doing some guesstimations in my head. 7.2 billion people in the world, 25 million in Australia. What could there be of that 144,000 living in Australia? And without working it out properly, I sort of said, well, maybe there's 3 people. I actually did the sums this week, and I discovered that Australia make up 0.3% of the world population. So 0.3% of the 144,000 leaves us with about 450 people. Now, this number is far greater than I originally thought, so maybe that would have given me the inspiration to hang in there a little bit. But when we break it down, 450 people in Australia, let's break that down to the Northern Rivers area. That then cuts us back to 5 people in the Northern Rivers area would be part of this number, if it was a literal number. Let's break it down even further and go, okay, there's 28,000 people living in the 2.2480 postcode. And out of that 28,000 people, how many people do we have remaining? About half a person. Now, the fact that you're here today, I don't think you think that is a literal number. But it's amazing the amount of thought process out here on this actual number. And like I said, depending on how you view this, or depending on your theology, will be how you will view this number. But for me, viewing this number as a literal number, it made me give up on God. I said to myself, man, if there's only 144,000, well then I'm not going to make the top 5 in the Northern Rivers area. I certainly won't make the half a person here in Lismore. But I'm so glad I've come to a different understanding of this number. And I'm glad that this is really not the focus of Revelation 7. And you'll notice there in my title that I haven't actually said anything about the 144,000, because really the theme of this passage is it's all because of the Lamb. It's all because of the Lamb. And but I want to remind us, because it's been a little while since we've been on this journey, I want to remind us of some of the keys that we have seen that's helped us to unlock what Revelation is all about. Because in Revelation we have some scary stuff, and I really liked what Lindy said when she was talking about the seals the other week. When she said, there's some scary stuff here, but if we just continue to focus on the Lamb, we will be okay. And thank you for those series that you did, Lindy, on the seals. But some of the keys that we have, well, the first key that we have in Revelation is in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 1. Revelation chapter 1 and verse 1 says, it is a revelation of Jesus Christ. So in everything we read and understand, we should see Jesus, or we should see the Lamb. And so that's one of the keys to help us to understand what we're studying. The next major key that we see is in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 19, where John is told to write what he has seen, the things that are, and the things that will take place after this. What did John see? John saw Jesus work on this earth. He saw the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And he also saw what was happening in his day. And now he's getting a vision of what's going to happen into the future. And so we know that that's the key to help us to understand the 7 churches, the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets. It takes us from John's time right through until when Jesus comes. So that's another one of the keys. The next key, the major key that we see, is in Revelation 3 and verse 21. And in Revelation 3 and verse 21 it says, to him who overcomes, I will grant to sit with me on my throne as I overcame and sat with my Father on his throne. And so that's the key that opens the next section. It tells us about the Father, the Creator, sitting on the throne in chapter 4, the next chapter. And then in the following chapter, we see how Jesus joins God on the throne, and it's he that is able to loose the seals of our destiny. And it's because of him then we see this pure gospel message going out in the white horse. And we see the result of that is that people give their lives to him and follow him and are able to get to a place where they will join Jesus on the throne. We see how that message got marred through the years. It became a red horse, it became a black horse, and it became a pale horse. And then in the 5th seal, we see those martyrs who were killed for doing the Lord's work. And their blood was crying out for God to bring judgment. And one of the questions asked, which I see is a key to help us to understand this next section as well, is how long? How long are you going to allow this behaviour to happen? How long are you going to allow evil to continue on this earth? How long till you do something about it? Well, chapter 6, the 6th seal, we see something being done. We see that something has been done, and it's pretty terrible because people are crying out for the rocks and the hills and the mountains to fall upon them. And then the question is asked, who will be able to stand? Who will be able to stand? Now, I'll remind you of our chiastic structure, and I've been showing this for people who have been coming each week, that Revelation is in a structure that builds towards the middle. And the last couple of times we've been looking at the section in red here in the 2 C's, the first section from chapter 4 through to chapter 8 and verse 1, and we see the mirroring of that, which is God's work for humanity's salvation. We see that God's work for humanity's salvation being complete in chapter 19 through to chapter 21 and verse 4. So we're seeing the work being done here, but we're seeing the work complete in this next section, and we're building towards the middle. We can actually finish the book of Revelation in the middle because we've been looking at either side. So I just want to remind you of that as we look. But as we look, we see again, and I'm just going to mention it a few times, we see the 5th seal, God's judgments being called for. How long are you going to allow evil to continue on? And then we see chapter 6, the aspects of God's justice in his judgments for those people that are doing terrible things. We see an earthquake, we see darkness, we see stars falling, we see every mountain and island fleeing from its place, and we're seeing people calling out not to be able to deal with this situation. And finally we get to that question that will help us to understand Revelation chapter 7, which is who will be able to stand? Who will be able to stand? And the answer to that is in chapter 7, this interlude between the sixth and the seventh seal. We don't get to look at the seventh seal until we get to chapter 8 and verse 1. So let's open our Bibles to Revelation chapter 7. Revelation chapter 7. Revelation chapter 7 says, "After these things I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth or the sea or any tree. Then I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God, and he cried with a loud voice to the 4 angels who it was granted to harm the earth, the sea, saying, Do not harm the earth and the sea or the trees till we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads." Remember, we're asked this question, who is able to stand? And here we get this picture. There's this little chiastic structure in these 3 verses here, and we find that in A that this destructive forces are being held back from the earth, the sea, and the trees. And then in verse 7 we get this angel is ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God, saying it was granted to him to harm the earth and the sea. Notice that the trees are actually missing from this section. And in verse 3 again we find that they're holding back the winds of strife from the earth, the sea and the trees. What this is telling us is that the trees looks like they're spared, whereas the earth and the sea face this destruction that is coming upon the earth. And already we've got this picture in the 6th seal of the destruction being universal. Every mountain fleeing from its place, an island out of place. And we see this universal scene here. But right here we see that the destruction is going to come on, but there is a group of people that are going to be protected or going to be sealed from these destructive forces. And it's the trees. What do the trees stand for? Any thoughts? Mankind. Yeah. Sometimes kings are mentioned as trees. But I love that passage in Psalms, and I want to read it to you in Psalms chapter 1 and verses 1 to 3. It says, "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the path of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night." And notice what verse 3 says. He says, "He shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water that bring forth their fruit in their seasons, whose leaf shall not wither, and whatever he does shall prosper." So we find that the trees here are spoken of as those that miss out on this destruction that is coming. And it's because of the seal of the living God. There's another passage in Jeremiah. There's other passages also that allude to the fact that trees represent human beings, but more so they represent human beings that have connected themselves to the Lord. So who is able to stand? We get this picture of these trees, but these trees that have been sealed by the living God. When we look at this sealing work, we find the first time we see that someone's got a mark or a seal on them is Cain himself. Cain himself after he killed his brother Abel, he was worried about being killed himself. And what did God do for Cain? Even though he did this terrible thing, he put a mark on him. And this mark was a mark of protection that would protect his life. It will protect him from being killed. So we find that the first person that we mentioned having a mark is Cain. The next one that I think is very important is when we ourselves, thank you Chris, when the Israelites themselves were in Egypt. And we saw the 10 plagues that were coming upon the Egyptians. And in that last plague, we saw what could be done to protect people's firstborn son in their households. And that was, if they were to kill the lamb, take the blood from the lamb, get a hyssop plant and paint the blood above the doorpost of their house. When the angel of death would come over, he would see that blood on the doorpost and realise that that house was protected by the blood of the lamb, and he would pass over without any destruction upon it. So we see God's people being sealed, God's people being protected by the blood of the lamb. One of the closest passages that matches our passage today in Revelation 7 is found in Ezekiel 9 verses 4 to 6. And I want us to turn to that passage, Ezekiel 9 verses 4 to 6. Keep your finger in Revelation because we'll be coming back there. And there's quite a few parallels in this section that match what we're looking at in Revelation 7. Ezekiel chapter 9. I'm going to start in verse 4. And the Lord said to him, "Go through the midst of the city, through the midst of Jerusalem, and put a mark on the foreheads of the men who sigh and cry over the abominations that are done within it." To the others he said in the hearing, "Go after him through the city and kill. Do not let your eyes spare, nor have pity. Utterly slay old and young, maidens and little children and women. But do not come near anyone who has the mark, and begin in my sanctuary." So they began. And verse 8 tells us that it was while they were killing them that I was left alone, and I fell on my face and I cried out and said, "Ah, Lord, will you destroy the remnant of Israel?" In other words, will anyone be able to stand this killing that is happening? The answer had already been given. Those who cried and sighed over the abominations that were happening in Israel. Those were the ones that had a mark on their foreheads. And it's interesting, some of the things that were happening. If you look at the previous chapter, we actually see 25 leading men in that area who were facing their backs towards the temple and looking and worshipping the sun. Turning their backs on God to worship earthly man-made gods. You know, ancients used seals to designate who belonged to the thing that was being sealed. Like, for instance, if you got a special letter with a seal on it, you could actually look closely at that seal and you would find 3 identifying marks to say who belonged to that piece of material that was given to you. And that is the person's name, their title, and their territory. And you know how we have this passage here, and it's talked about as the land and the sea and the trees. We're clearly talking about God's creation. And what is the sealing mark of God's creation? Call it out. The Sabbath. The last thing that he did, he set aside and he blessed and he made holy this particular day. And Ezekiel 20:20 tells us to hallow my Sabbaths because they will be a sign between me and you, that you may know that I am the Lord your God. That gives us a bit of an indication of what this seal has. It has something to do with. But God wants us to be like trees that are rooted and drinking of that living water so that we can be sealed through this time of trouble. We find that the one doing the sealing work comes from the east. We find that the Garden of Eden was in the east. We find in Isaiah that Cyrus was talked about as being the human deliverer. We find in Ezekiel 43 the saving God himself coming from the east. And we see in Matthew 2 that the wise men followed the star from the east. We find that the one from the east here is Jesus himself coming to do this sealing work. So let's turn to this passage that you think that it all focuses on. In verse 4 it says, "And I heard the number of those who were sealed, 144,000. Of all the tribes of the children of Israel were sealed. Of the tribe of Judah, 12,000. Of the tribe of Reuben, 12,000. Of the tribe of Gad, Asher, Naphtali, Manasseh, Simeon, Levi, Ishkar, Zebulun, Joseph and Benjamin. All 12,000. 12,000. 12,000 is a very important number. You know, it reminds me of doing studies with a young girl called Eva Suffolk. Most of you know this young lady. I was doing studies with the girls, and Eva, all she wanted to study about was numbers in the Bible. She said, let's do a study on numbers in the Bible. Different numbers. You know what was really heartwarming to me? Is that she saw the significance of numbers. This 12-year-old girl saw the significance that numbers held in the Bible. And you only have to do a study on the number 3. You see the number 3 coming up, and it represents God so often. We find the number 4 represents the entire people of this earth. From the 4 corners, from the 4 winds, from the 4 areas, it was spoken of as the entirety of the earth. In other words, humanity. We see the number 7. We've already spoke about the importance of the number 7 and how significant it is and how it represents perfection and completeness. And it's made up of the number 3 and 4. But we see this number 12 is made up of 3 times 4. And 12 is also a number of completeness, a number of God's people. And we think to ourselves, like I did, 144,000, that's not a lot of people. But for those ancients back then, if you were to mention 1,000 people, that was a way of saying a whole huge number of people. Probably like we'd say 1 billion people today. It's that sort of mentality in which it was used in. And the interesting thing, though, more than anything, is that this Greek word for 1,000 actually represents a tribe or a clan or a regiment, an army of people. We find back in Numbers, Moses was asked to prepare an army, and they were to have 1,000 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. 1,000 from this tribe, 1,000 from this one, 1,000. In other words, we want a lot of people from your tribe, a lot of people from your tribe, and there was this complete number because there was 12 of them, 12 lots of them. But here, when he mentions 12 by 12 by 12 by 12, you know, and the language is more 12 1,000, 12 1,000, 12 1,000. So it's a complete big number that we're talking about. So let's go over to verse 9. And in verse 9 it says, "After these things I looked and beheld a great multitude which no one could number, of all nations, tribes, people, tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes, with palm branches in their hands." So here we have now that John's heard about a number. He now looks and he sees another number, and this number is called a great multitude. First, I want to look at this idea of them being in white robes. You know, white robes is a thing that's not mentioned a lot in the Bible. We know it represents the righteousness of Christ being placed upon us. But the first time that we see it is in Mark chapter 16 when Jesus had risen from the tomb and the tomb was empty. And when they looked in, they saw this person in a white robe sitting in the tomb asking who you were looking for. The next time we see it is on the Mount of Transfiguration in the book of Luke to describe the clothing that Jesus was now wearing, that his clothing become white, so pure and so holy. And the next time we see it, we don't see it until Revelation chapter 4 and verse 4. In Revelation chapter 4 and verse 4, we're told about 24 elders. And we looked at that number. It's a number of 12 and 12. And these 24 elders, what are they doing? They're wearing white robes. The next time we see it is when we looked at one of our keys to understand this passage in Revelation 6 and verse 11. When these people said, how long? When the blood that was crying out from these people, they said, how long are you going to allow this to continue on? And the answer was that they were given white robes, each of them. And it was said to them that they should rest a little while longer until both the number of their fellow servants and their brethren who would have been killed were complete. In other words, God's waiting for this number to be complete. It reminds us of the wedding feast that we have in Matthew, where he went out and he invited all these people and they didn't come. And the number wasn't complete, so they went out into the highways and the byways. They went out into everywhere until the room was actually filled. And then there was someone that didn't have the wedding garment. And they had to be thrown out. But here we have that those were slain were given white robes and told to wait until their number was complete. And now, in Revelation 7, we're seeing this great multitude and they're wearing white robes. The next time we see it is a little later on when it asks the question, who are these in white robes? And the answer is given, these are they who washed their robes in the blood of the Lamb. Always astounds me how you can get something so white after washing it in red. Who's experienced that with washing clothes? Anyone? Not one hand. Yeah. But here, there's this great multitude that's standing in white robes, and they're there because of the blood of the Lamb. It's giving us this picture that they were victorious, all because of the blood of the Lamb. Palm branches also and white robes were a part of a ritual celebrating military success. And we look at this word for multitude, it can also mean an army of people. An army of people. Something else that happens in Revelation that I want you to see. Actually, we're not going to look at all these passages. I'll just tell you about them. You can look them up later. You can write them down if you like. But in Revelation 1 and verse 10, we see that John is given a vision. And the first thing that John notices is that he hears a trumpet. And when he hears a trumpet, the next verse tells us he looks and he sees what? The Son of Man walking amongst the 7 golden candlesticks. So what John hears is a voice like a trumpet, but what he sees is the Son of Man, and the voice obviously comes from the Son of Man. The next time we see a vision happening where John is hearing something is in chapter 5, where he hears of the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And when John looks, what does he see? Does he see a lion? You're not sure. He sees a lamb. And not just any lamb, a lamb as though it has been slain. Let me tell you, in the animal kingdom, you don't really get too much further apart than a lion and lamb. But what do the lion and the lamb both represent? Jesus. So what John hears is a lion, but when he looks, he sees the slain lamb. Come over to Revelation chapter 17, verse 1, and what do we hear? He hears about a harlot sitting on many waters. But when he looks, he sees a woman sitting on a scarlet beast. We know that the many waters represents many nations, tongues, kindreds and people. So we see that the sitting on the beast is the beast over all these different groups of people. So again here, what John hears and what he sees is the same thing. What I want us to turn to is Revelation chapter 21 and verse 12. Revelation chapter 21. And verse 10 we'll start at. And he carried me away in the Spirit to a great high mountain and showed me the great city, the holy Jerusalem. Let's go back to verse 9. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls filled with the 7 last plagues came to me and talked with me, saying, so he's talking to him and he says, come, I will show you the bride, the wife, the Lamb's wife. If we were just to read this verse in isolation, when we hear the things across the internet that Jesus had a bride, you think, oh yes, it's true. But who is the bride? That verse that we just read before, he come away and he showed him, so he sees the great city, the holy Jerusalem, descending down from heaven from God. So what John hears is about the wife of the Lamb. But when he sees, what does he see? He sees the city, Jerusalem. Now we're going to see that the city, Jerusalem, actually is the bride of the Lamb. We're going to see that this is another way of actually showing us that this is God's people. We are the bride of Christ, those who are connected to him. And so we find that in verse 12 it says, also it had a great high wall with 12 gates, and the 12 angels of the gates, and the names on the 12 gates were of the children of Israel. So this city, this New Jerusalem, has got on its gates, what has it got? The names of the tribes of Israel. How many tribes of Israel? 12. We go down a little bit further in verse 14, we find that it has 12 walls, and on the foundations of the 12 walls, what have we got? The 12 apostles. So this New Jerusalem is made up of a complete number of people who come to know Christ through the children of Israel, a complete number of those who come to know Christ through the 12 apostles. 12 by 12. We find the thickness of the walls was 144 cubits. We find this picture in here. This New Jerusalem is actually the bride of Christ, spoken of as a number measuring 12 by 12 by 12. In other words, this city is complete with everyone in it from all ages. So going back to John chapter 7, we notice that there also in verse 4 that John only ever hears the number. And the number he hears is 144,000. But when he looks, he sees a great multitude. Both represented as an army of people, both recorded as servants of God. And yet we get so hung up on this number and we miss what this passage is really trying to say. This passage is really trying to say that God's people is a complete number. And he wants everyone to be a part of that number. And that number is beyond numbering. I can't number it, you can't number it, because I can't determine your decision and you can't determine my decision. But let's look at the last part of this chapter. In chapter 7 and verse 14 it said, And I said to him, Sir, you know. So he said to me, and this is in relation to who are those in white robes. And he says, These are they who come out of the great tribulation and washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Therefore they are before the throne of God, and they serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will dwell among them. and they shall neither hunger any more or thirst any more. The sun shall not strike them, nor any heat. Remember, we talked about in our chiastic structure this pattern of this is God's work for humanity's salvation, and we find this work being complete. And then the passage that mirrors this is found in Revelation 21, 1-4. And I'll just read verse 17 of chapter 7 first. For the Lamb who is in the midst of the throne will shepherd them and lead them to living fountains of waters, and God will wipe every tear from their eyes. When we find God's work complete in Revelation 21 verse 3, it says, And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people. God himself will be with them and be their God, and God will wipe every tear from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away. What a time to look forward to. It's not a time to worry about the destruction that's going to come upon the earth, because if we're following the Lamb wherever he goes, we will be sealed. It doesn't tell us that we won't face persecution, but it tells us that we will be sealed in our decision, because the Holy Spirit is given to us. When we look back at our passage, we see in these first few chapters that the destructive forces are coming upon the earth, but we see that Jesus is still in control. He's saying, hold off. Don't let those winds go yet. Hold off until we've sealed the servants of our God. Hold off till we've put a mark in their foreheads, to say that they belong to me, to say that they are my children, and I'm going to protect them through that time. Going back and helping us to understand this passage and what the main focus of this passage is, we find in the fifth seal a question is asked, how long? How long are you going to allow evil to happen? You know, so many people don't believe because they see so much evil. And how can God allow this to happen? This question has been asked throughout the eternal ages. And here the answer is given. It's going to be a little bit longer. It's going to be a little bit longer because there's still people I want to save. There's still a work for us to do. It's not time. I was asked the other day whether it was time to run to the mountains. I said it's not time to run to the mountains. There's still people that God wants to save. And we need to work on helping them to make that decision for God. How long? The answer, remember the answer? Until the number is complete. Until the number is complete. Then we see God's judgments coming upon the earth. We see the destruction that is happening, and the question is asked, who will be able to stand? And we find this message of hope in Revelation 7, which is what this is really all about. It's not about a number and understanding this way or understanding it that way. This is a way of describing that God's people is a complete number from all the tribes of Israel. Paul tells us that all Israel will be saved, but he also tells us that not all Israel are Israel, because Israel represents those who have fought and overcome, and they've washed their robes in the blood of the Lamb. The description given in chapter 14 is they've followed the Lamb wherever he goes. So we don't need to fear for what is about to come upon the earth, because God's going to seal his people. What we need to make sure, I'm glad someone responded to that, what we need to make sure is that we are connected to the Lamb. So as we look at the destruction that has happened in our own town, the things that are happening, the things that are yet to come, let's give that message of hope. That God is still in control, that we have a better future if we hold on to